In this tutorial, we're going to look at the Play tab, playback and playback devices, the mixer, live playback, and live tempo. First thing I'd like to do in this tutorial is play back a little bit of this score using the Sibelius 7 sounds library. Now this is a 38GB library of orchestral, rock and pop, jazz sounds that's included with Sibelius out of the box. And I think you'll agree, for the included sound library it sounds pretty fantastic. Let's play it back for you now. So now we've heard some of this sound library, let's have a look how we set up Sibelius to use the Sibelius 7 sounds. We're in the Play tab, and the first thing we'll look at is configuration. If I click on it, we get a very simple drop-down menu. Now, one of the single most complicated things of previous versions of Sibelius was setting up the playback. And we can still go in and mess with the more complicated areas if we want to, and we'll talk about that shortly. But I just want to show you how very easy it is. If I want to change from a particular sound set, the Sibelius 7 sounds, yes, it's 38GB, and if you are running a big score like this, then I advise you to have plenty of RAM in your system. However, if you don't have a particularly powerful system, what you can use is the Sibelius Sounds Lite library. Now this cuts down on some of the key switch sounds which also load simultaneously, so this will use a lot less RAM. So if I flick over into this one now and hit the escape key a couple of times and P for play, it's going to load up that library. So you'll notice that the library loaded up and loaded the sounds very, very quickly, but it didn't have quite such richness or depth as the full library has. That's because it uses slightly smaller samples with a slightly limited dynamic range. So yes, you're still going to get a great idea of how your score would sound in this case with a full symphony orchestra, but you're not going to get the depth and richness of playback as you would with the full library. So let's switch back over to that now. You'll also see that it doesn't bother loading up all the instruments in a kind of jazz style, because obviously if you put a jazz big band chart up, which we'll do in a second, you want to be using the Sibelius Sounds Jazz library. You don't want the orchestral saxophone sounds that would be used in a score like Awakening here to be used in a jazz big band part. So let's open up a big band score. Into configuration, and let's make sure we're using the Sibelius 7 Jazz library this time. Back to the beginning, press play. So that's some of the jazz library loaded up there. Now we've had a look before in this setup dialog, and the Sibelius player is listed as my active device. However, I have all these other playback devices that I can use. So to create a new playback configuration, all I have to do is hit New. I have to give it a title, so let's call this one DLS Music. OK. And it now gives me access to all the available devices on my system. Now you'll notice these were greyed out. That's because the Sibelius player configuration cannot be altered. It's only a preset. I'm now editing my DLS music configuration. I'm going to deactivate the Sibelius player and activate the DLS music device. Now this is the Macintosh's own built-in GM library. I'm going to save it. Now I'm going to close, and you'll see in configurations I now have DLS music device. Back to the beginning, let's hear how this sounds. First of all, it's a bigger score than DLS can handle. That's pretty much as GM as you're ever going to get. Back to the Sibelius sounds. It's going to load the samples up. Much more fulfilling, I think you'll agree. If I go back over into setup, I can create another new one. So let's go. I could use my Vienna ensemble this time. What I could choose to do is pair this with the Sibelius library. And you'll see that because I've brought the Vienna ensemble into the mix, it's opened up the Vienna ensemble player behind Sibelius. We'll talk more about third-party AU audio unit or VST instruments in the next video. But for the time being, it's worth knowing that this is how you can set up all your other devices. Let's go back over into the Awakening score now. Again, press play. It's going to load up the samples pretty quickly. When setting up the sound of your score for an audio performance, level and dynamics are all important. So obviously we've marked up our score with the dynamics, but we may need to tweak the individual levels of the instruments, and we do that in the mixer. And the shortcut for this is M. You can see down here that each of my instruments in my score is assigned a channel. Let me bury the keypad. And you can see here that the mixer runs from left to right. Now at the moment I'm viewing the mixer in its smallest possible mode, so I can just see the volume sliders. If I click this button again, I can now see the solo and mutes and the pan controls for where my instruments sit in the stereo field. If I hit it again, I can now see a little bit more information about the instrument and how it's playing back, which MIDI channel, what player it's using, what the actual instrument is, which sound ID from the Sibelius sound world it's been assigned. We'll talk about that in the next video. I can test the sound. And if I was using a third-party playback device, I'd be able to get to the interface for this particular device. The Sibelius 7 player does not allow you to get into the individual settings of the player. It's all done for you automatically. Now, some of the more performance-based instruments have this little arrow to hide or show the smart knobs. These are ways to get in and really tweak the sound a little bit more. Like on this jazz trumpet part, for example, we have attack, resonance, the cutoff, and the mono or poly setting for more than one instrument on a stave. Timps, for example, have a tone control. Drum kit has quite a lot of control over the microphones, the overheads, talkback mics, room size. Hit this option again. It shows me my reverb and chorus sends for each of the instruments. Now the reverb can really help you put your score into a particular setting, be it a concert hall style or an arena or a smaller room or a smaller environment. It's the reverb that's going to make your score sound more real. I also have options down the bottom for adding a master fader, showing or hiding the individual instruments, showing or hiding the grouped instruments, in this case wind, brass, percussion, strings. I can show the virtual instruments, in this case the Sibelius player. And I can also show the effects routing. These are not included in the reverb and chorus sections on the main mixer, which are automatically added to every score you open in Sibelius 7. So here I can see master fader, all my instruments, my grouped instruments, my main player volume, and my effects. I also get a rather useful little icon here showing me how much CPU usage I'm using. So as I press play on this score, you can see it starts to rise. Now with the more instruments I add, obviously the CPU usage goes up. If I want to, I can solo instrument groups. Now you can see here I've muted the click track. However, if I want to put that back in to record another part along in real time, there's the click track muted again.